Our application is now in a pretty complete state. So now we're going to start to think about how we could take this app and deploy it online. Let's first begin with a quick discussion about how our application is being executed right now on our local machine. So of course, this is what is going on your computer right now. We've got post, comments, query, moderation, and event bus. They're all running on some very specific ports, and each of them can reach directly out to the other services and send messages, make requests, whatever is required. It's very direct and simple communication between each of our different services. So how can we somehow take this same kind of structure, make as few changes as possible, and deploy it online? Well, a very easy way to do this would be to go out to DigitalOcean or AWS, Microsoft Azure, whoever else, and rent a virtual machine. Once we get that virtual machine, we could transfer all of our services over to it. Like when I say transfer, I really just mean copy our source code and then run each of these services in the exact same way that we are doing right now. So we can have all the services communicating with each other by reaching out directly over localhost and trying to access port 4000, 4001, and so on. So this would definitely work without a doubt. But as we start to really think through this scenario and think about how we would grow our application in the future, well, life starts to get a little bit more challenging. Let me show you what I mean. Let's imagine for a second that our comment service right here is starting to become really overburdened. Maybe we have a tremendous number of users coming into our application and trying to create comments. And so at some point in time, we might decide that we need to create a second or a third instance of this comment server just to handle this additional demand. A very easy way to do that would be to say, on the same virtual machine, let's create 2 new copies of that comment service. So now we've got the original copy right here and 2 more over here. Whenever someone tries to create a comment, we can then load balance between these 3 different services. When I say load balance, I essentially mean just randomize which server their incoming request goes to. Now there's a couple of challenges with this approach. First off, these additional copies of the comment service would have to be allocated some new port on this machine. So maybe we would have port 4006 and 4007 right there. That's relevant because remember, our event bus needs to know the exact IP address and port of all the different services that it's going to send events to. So in other words, as soon as we create these additional copies of the comment service over here, we would have to open up our event bus code. And as a matter of fact, I can do that right now. Here's my event bus index.js file. We would have to find where we tried to take an event and send it off to all these other running services. And we would have to add in 2 additional lines right here. Something like maybe 4006 and 7, like so. So if we follow this approach, then we're going to start to couple or very directly tie the number of services that we are running with the actual implementation of our code. If we ever decide to increase or decrease the number of comment servers running at any given time, we are going to have to make a change to our event bus code and deploy that change as well. And I bet, as you can imagine, that would probably not be too great. This whole scenario gets even more complicated if we see that the comment services right here that we added on are overburdening the one virtual machine we have. So let's imagine for a second that we decide to get a second virtual machine and run those 2 additional comment services on the second machine. Maybe they are still listed at port 4006 and 7. But now the event bus not only needs to know or keep track of ports 4006 and 7, but it also is going to have some code to figure out how to reach out to this other virtual machine and eventually get access or send some events to the comment service right there and the comment service right there. So once again, we would have to open up our event bus file, and rather than make your request to localhost, we'd have to put in the IP address of that other virtual machine, like so. And once again, I bet, as you can imagine, that would be really tedious. Finally, let's imagine a scenario, just one more scenario here very quickly. Let's imagine for a second that our website is very popular at just certain times of the day. So maybe at 10 a.m. in the morning, a lot of people come to our website and they start to create comments. And so at 10 a.m. in the morning, we would want to have these additional copies of the comment service running. But then maybe at 1 a.m. in the morning, like at the dead of night, maybe nobody is coming to our application. And so in order to save money on our hosting fees, we might decide at 1 a.m. to temporarily shut down this second virtual machine and just say, hey, no one's coming to our website. We don't need those additional copies of the common service. So let's just temporarily turn all that stuff off. So now in this scenario, once again, the event bus needs to know that that second virtual machine is now dead and it should not attempt to send any events over there. Well, to handle that, we would have to come back over to our event bus and maybe add in some code and say something like, if it is 1 a.m., or I should say if it is not 1 a.m., then go ahead and attempt to send the incoming event off to those other two services. And once again, as I'm sure you can imagine, this is definitely not something we would ever want to write out right here. We would never want to say, oh, well, if it's a certain time of the day, let's try making a request over to these additional copies. So everything we're discussing now is really going down towards a very bad path. We are trying to put together this event bus and have it communicate between all these different services in a very direct and imperative fashion. We're trying to say, hey, event bus, you need to keep track of all the different services, and you need to make sure that you always send every incoming event to every service that is running, and you need to keep track of whether or not they are running. This is all just over the top complex, way too confusing, and there's probably no way we would be able to pull this off very easily. So I think it's pretty clear at this point that although what we have right now is working on our local machine, it would probably not work in the long term. We need a better solution. We need something that's going to keep track of all the different services that are running inside of our application, has the ability to maybe create new copies of a service on the fly, and make sure that we have something as well that can automatically figure out whether or not a service is running and whether or not we should maybe try to make contact between two given services. So this is all going to lead us into a really big discussion in this section in all the next coming videos around two big open source technologies called Docker and Kubernetes. So we're going to take a pause right here. We're going to come back in the next video and have a quick discussion on Docker. We're going to get a little bit more familiar with it and then do the same thing with Kubernetes as well.